What if I told you that the war between Russia and Ukraine didn't start in 2022? What if I told you this story began long before tanks rolled in, before politicians made speeches, before the world even realized what was at stake? Because this war isn't just about borders. It's about power, control, and the world's struggle to define a new order. February 24th, 2022, a day that shook the planet. In the early hours before dawn, Russian missiles lit up the skies over Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. Families huddled in basements. Children cried in the cold. And for millions watching around the world, one question echoed louder than the explosions. Why? Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Why now? And what truth lies buried beneath the speeches, the propaganda, and the politics? To understand this war, we must step back, way back, through time, through borders, through centuries of history written in blood and ambition. Because this story isn't just about two nations. It's about East versus West, about NATO and power, America and influence, Putin and legacy, Europe and energy, and a new Cold War quietly unfolding before our eyes. Ukraine, once a jewel of the Soviet Empire, a land rich in wheat, coal and courage, but more than resources. Ukraine holds something far greater, geographic destiny. It sits like a bridge between two worlds, Russia to the east, Europe to the west, and whoever controls Ukraine controls the gateway between them. For decades, the Cold War divided the world in two, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a new world was born. Freedom spread across Eastern Europe, NATO expanded, and Russia, humiliated and broken, watched as the West celebrated its victory. But not everyone saw it as victory. For some in Moscow, it was betrayal. One of those men was Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who watched his country crumble from the inside. He once called the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. From that moment, his mission was clear: to restore Russia's strength, to reclaim what was lost, and to make the world fear Russia again. For years, the world underestimated him. But while the West was distracted by wars in the Middle East and economic crises, Putin was rebuilding, piece by piece. Oil, gas, cyberpower, propaganda, and slowly, his eyes turned toward Ukraine. You see, Ukraine isn't just another neighbor to Russia. It's the heart of what Russians call the motherland. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is where the story of the Russian civilization itself began. Over 1,000 years ago, before Russia was even Russia, there was Kievan Rus, a medieval empire that laid the foundation for both modern Ukraine and Russia. So to Putin, Ukraine isn't foreign soil. It's the birthplace of his nation's identity. But there was one problem. After independence, Ukraine started looking west, not east, joining hands with Europe, seeking NATO protection, dreaming of democracy and freedom. And to Putin, that was a red line, because if Ukraine joined NATO, it would mean Western missiles right on Russia's doorstep, just 300 miles from Moscow. In Putin's eyes, this wasn't defense, it was encirclement. And so, the seeds of conflict were planted. For years, tension grew quietly. 2004, 2014, Ukraine's revolutions, corruption scandals, protests in Kyiv's Maidan Square, where people died for the dream of freedom. Russia responded with force. Crimea was annexed. Donbass erupted in war, but the world moved on. Until 2022, when the world woke up and realized that the fuse had been burning all along. This war is not just a regional conflict. It's the collision of two worldviews. The West's vision of a democratic global order, and Russia's dream of restoring its imperial power. And caught in the middle, the Ukrainian people, ordinary men and women, forced to carry the weight of history on their shoulders. The real story of the Russia-Ukraine war isn't just about land, it's about the battle for truth. Because behind every headline, there's a shadow war being fought, with disinformation, money and manipulation. Who's really winning, and who's really pulling the strings? To answer that, we must go deeper, into the roots of power, history, and the global chessboard that few ever see. This is the story of a war that could reshape the 21st century. A war that began not with missiles, but with fear. The Cold War never ended. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the world cheered. It was the end of an age, the end of fear. The Cold War was over, or so we thought. But in truth, the Cold War never ended. It simply changed shape. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. 15 new countries emerged from its ruins, each struggling to find its place in a world dominated by one superpower, the United States. For the first time in modern history, there was no balance of power. The world had become unipolar, and America stood alone at the top. Washington promised a new era of peace and prosperity. But in Moscow, the story looked very different. Russia was broken. Its economy collapsed. Inflation exploded. Millions lost their savings overnight. Factories shut down. Pensions disappeared. And a proud people who had once ruled an empire were suddenly told they had lost. For ordinary Russians, the 1990s were not freedom. They were humiliation. And humiliation, when left to boil, breeds something dangerous: revenge. As Russia struggled to survive, the West expanded. NATO, once created to contain the Soviet Union, began moving east. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, then the Baltic states, step by step, closer to Moscow. And each time Russia protested, and each time the West said the same thing. It's not about you. It's about freedom. But to Russian generals it felt like betrayal. Because back in 1990, as Germany was being reunited, American diplomats had promised that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. That promise was broken. By 2004, NATO had added 7 more countries. Russia was surrounded. Its old allies had joined the enemy's camp. And deep inside the Kremlin, the idea of cooperation began to rot. When Vladimir Putin rose to power in 1999, many in the West saw him as a modernizer. He spoke of democracy, free markets, even friendship with the United States. Russia would join the global economy, he said, not fight it. But behind that smile was a man who had witnessed his country's humiliation firsthand, and he had sworn it would never happen again. While the West saw globalization as progress, Putin saw it as submission. He rebuilt Russia's oil and gas industry. He reasserted control over the media. And he began testing the world's patience, quietly, strategically. In Chechnya, he crushed rebellion. In Georgia, he tested NATO's limits. And each time, the world condemned him, but did nothing. So when Ukraine began to drift toward Europe, Putin saw history repeating itself. And this time he vowed to stop it. You see, to understand Putin's actions, you must understand the Russian mind, shaped by centuries of invasion and survival. From Napoleon to Hitler, Russia has always lived with the fear of being surrounded, invaded, destroyed. That fear became part of its DNA. So when NATO tanks moved closer, Putin didn't see democracy. He saw threat. But this wasn't just about borders. It was about resources, oil, gas, and the lifeblood of Europe's economy. Russia held the pipelines. Europe needed the gas. It was a marriage of dependence, and Putin knew it. For decades, he supplied Europe with cheap energy, and in return, Europe looked the other way. Billions flowed into Moscow, and Putin built his war chest, waiting for the right moment to strike. But power is never permanent. And in 2014, that balance began to crumble. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, a man loyal to Moscow, rejected a deal with the European Union. Protests erupted in Kiev. The people demanded freedom, democracy, and independence. What began as peaceful turned violent. Hundreds were killed. And in the end, Yanukovych fled the country. For Putin, that was the breaking point. He saw it as a Western-backed coup, a direct attack on Russia's influence. And within weeks, Russian troops moved into Crimea. The peninsula was annexed in 2014, a move that shocked the world. But once again, no one stopped him. That's when Putin realized something crucial. He could break international law, and the West would still negotiate. Sanctions would come, words would be spoken, but Russia would survive. And so began a new kind of war, Not with tanks, but with energy, propaganda and information. Cyber attacks on European grids, fake news flooding social media, troll farms creating division. Subscribe my channel for next part and next video will upload soon.